She gave him 6 years. 6 years of silence, sacrifice, and slow disappearing. And the morning he finally spoke, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for permission to sleep with other women. He called it a modern arrangement. He said it with coffee in his hand and calm in his eyes, as if he were rescheduling a meeting. That morning, Vivian Hale did not cry. She did not scream. She picked up her bag, walked out the door, and swallowed the wreckage whole. But before this night is over, a stranger in a black suit will hand her something far more dangerous than a business card. He will hand her back herself. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from nothing, this story is for you. Watch until the very end. Hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Cut. The alarm didn't wake her. Vivian had been awake since 4, lying on her side of the bed with her eyes fixed on the water stain above the closet door. The one she'd been meaning to report to the building super for 3 months, then 2 months, then never. She'd stopped tracking the small broken things. There were too many of them. Miles was already in the kitchen when she came out. She could hear the coffee maker, the scrape of his spoon against the ceramic mug he'd bought at some boutique market upstate on the weekend trip they took 2 summers ago, back when weekend trips still felt like something other than shared logistics. He was dressed already. Pressed collar, the charcoal trousers she'd had dry cleaned last Thursday. He looked organized. He looked like a man with a plan. She poured herself coffee and stood at the counter, and he said it without preamble, without sitting down, without any of the softening devices that a person uses when they understand they are about to cause pain. He just said it. He'd been reading about open relationships. He thought it might be something worth exploring. He used the word modern. He used the phrase more honest. He said he thought they had both been pretending for a while now, and wasn't it better to just acknowledge that they were 2 separate people with separate needs? Vivian set her mug down very carefully. She didn't trust her hands. He kept talking. He said something about how this wasn't about her. He said something about emotional growth. The words arrived in her ears and dissolved before they reached anything deeper because underneath all of it, underneath the careful language and the rehearsed cadence, she could hear what he was actually saying. He was saying he'd already decided. He was saying the question was just a formality. He was saying he wanted her to hand him the key to the door he had clearly already walked through. She asked him once, very quietly, if there was someone. He didn't answer immediately. That was the answer. She picked up her bag. She said she had to get to a client walkthrough by 9. He called her name as she reached the door. Not with urgency, not with regret, just with the mild irritation of a man who expected his conversation to conclude on his own terms. She closed the door behind her. She walked down 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was too small and too slow, and she needed the movement, needed her legs to do something purposeful while the rest of her went completely, carefully numb. By the time she reached the street, the Brooklyn morning was the color of old concrete, gray and flat and indifferent. She walked 6 blocks to the subway without putting her headphones in. She needed to hear the street. Taxis. Someone arguing on a fire escape. A delivery guy cursing at a double-parked sedan. Evidence that the world was still grinding forward exactly as it had been, that nothing visible had changed, even though something inside her chest felt like it had been quietly disconnected from its housing. A wire pulled loose, the light still flickering but no longer reaching anything. She had a job to do. She always had a job to do. That was the thing about being invisible. The work never stopped asking for you. Vivian Hale had spent the last 3 years working as a senior coordinator for Hargrove Event Group, a mid-tier firm that specialized in handling the operational machinery of high-end social events, charity galas, corporate dinners, product launches for luxury brands that paid handsomely to make money look effortless. She was not the face of any of it. She was the architecture behind it, the person who made sure the flowers arrived 90 minutes before the guests so they could open properly under the lighting, who memorized every vendor's name and cell number, who walked the floor twice before any event began to find the one thing that would go wrong and neutralize it before it did. She was extraordinarily good at her job. Nobody said so out loud. It was the kind of excellence that gets taken for granted, the kind that only becomes visible the moment it disappears. She'd gone to school for design, not event coordination. Interior design, spaces, light, the psychology of how a room makes a person feel before they understand why. She'd graduated near the top of her class from a program in Boston that had turned out 3 names that appeared regularly in the pages of Architectural Digest. Her senior thesis had been on sensory layering in residential luxury, the way texture and acoustics and spatial proportion conspire to produce an emotional experience the occupant can't fully articulate. Her advisor had used the word remarkable. Her classmates had used the word intimidating. She'd been 22 with a portfolio and a very specific vision of what she was going to build. Then she'd met Miles, and Miles had been building something too, something urgent and consuming and perpetually almost there, and she'd loved him enough to put her own momentum on pause. 6 months became a year became 3. The design work became freelance, the freelance became occasional, the occasional became nothing, buried beneath the coordinating and the managing and the quiet arithmetic of a life organized around another person's ambition. She hadn't noticed it happening. That was the part she couldn't forgive herself for. Not the sacrifice, the invisibility of it. She'd made herself so small she'd stopped being able to find herself in the room. The Castellano Gala was tonight. She had exactly 9 hours. The Castellano family occupied a penthouse on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown, whose lobby alone cost more than some countries spent on public infrastructure. Elara Castellano, the family's 71-year-old matriarch, hosted one charity gala per year. It raised money for arts education in underfunded public schools, which struck everyone who knew the Castellanos as faintly ironic, given how thoroughly the family had insulated themselves from anything resembling public life. But the money went where it was supposed to go, the event was real, and the guest list was the kind of room where 4 governors, 2 film directors, a sitting federal judge, and roughly 30% of Manhattan's private wealth could be found eating small plates of smoked duck and pretending to care about string quartets. Vivienne arrived at the penthouse at 1 in the afternoon, 6 hours before the first guest. She walked every inch of the space with her checklist and her phone and the absolute focused attention she gave to nothing else in her life. The florist had delivered 6 arrangements instead of 8. She called the florist. The sound engineer had rigged the left speaker cluster to point 15 degrees off from the ambient music coverage zone. She moved it herself rather than wait. The catering company had placed the dessert display on a platform that sat unevenly on the marble floor. A 4mm tilt that would mean nothing now and catastrophe later when a guest bumped the table edge and sent $12,000 worth of spun sugar sculpture onto the floor. She told the catering captain. He nodded without looking up. She told him again. He said they'd get to it. She leveled the platform herself using a wedge shim she carried in her bag, specifically for situations like this. And when the captain finally looked over and saw what she'd done, his expression moved through surprise and irritation before landing, reluctantly, on acknowledgement. That was fine. She didn't need the acknowledgement. By 6:30, the penthouse was operational. By 7, the first guests had begun arriving, moving through the entry gallery in that particular way of people who are extremely wealthy and extremely accustomed to beautiful rooms, taking everything in while appearing to notice nothing, conducting invisible hierarchical assessments behind expressions of polite boredom. Vivienne moved through the crowd in the gray uniform of the event staff, adjusting, redirecting, answering questions before they were asked, making the invisible machinery run. She was near the dessert display, positioned there deliberately, still not entirely trusting the platform, when he arrived. She noticed him the way she noticed structural problems. Not because she was looking, but because something in her peripheral awareness registered an irregularity. He came through the entry with 2 men who walked like they were paid to think about what walked toward them, and he moved through the room differently than anyone else moved through it. Everyone else was performing. He wasn't. He had the specific stillness of a person who has never once needed to perform for any room they've entered, because they already knew, without needing confirmation, exactly what they were. Nico DeLuca was 38 years old and wore a dark suit that had been cut specifically for him by someone who understood that the point wasn't decoration. He was Korean American, the son of a union between 2 worlds that most people treated as separate, and he'd spent his life in that intersection, neither fully of one world nor the other, which had given him a kind of doubled vision that he'd turned into the most dangerous possible tool. He ran DeLuca International, a luxury hotel group whose portfolio spanned 7 cities and whose revenue was reported, accurately, in the billions. What the revenue reports did not reflect was the other operation, The one that had made the DeLuca name a weight in certain conversations in certain rooms that were never discussed publicly. He was feared. He was also, in ways that his enemies occasionally discovered too late, scrupulously intelligent. Vivian didn't know any of this yet. She saw a man who moved like he owned the floor beneath his feet, and she registered him the way she registered any potential variable in an event space, as something to account for. She was lifting a tray to reposition a sugar sculpture when the catering assistant behind her caught the edge of the display table with her elbow. Vivian heard the creak of the platform before she saw it move, turned in time to see the centerpiece piece tilting forward, and lunged. She caught the base with both hands, dropping one knee to the floor to get under the weight, holding it stable while 340 people nearby noticed nothing. She was straightening, resettling the piece, checking the platform alignment again, when she became aware of him standing approximately 4 feet away. He'd moved from across the room. She didn't know when. He was simply there now, watching her with the quiet attention of someone conducting an evaluation, not an inspection. She met his eyes for a moment and then looked back at the display table because the job wasn't finished yet. "That platform's been wrong since setup," she said, not to him particularly, just to the air in front of her. "I saw you correct it 3 hours ago," he said. She looked at him again. He'd been in this building for 3 hours. She hadn't seen him arrive. She said, "Then you saw why it needed doing twice." He didn't smile. He looked at her with the kind of attention that most people reserve for things they're deciding whether to acquire, and she felt the sudden acute awareness of her gray staff blazer and her clipboard, and the fact that she was kneeling next to a dessert table in the middle of a 43rd floor penthouse, in clothes designed to make her disappear. She stood. He said, "You've been running this event by yourself for 6 hours." It wasn't a question. "That's my job," she said. "That's not what I said." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a card. Matte black. No logo. A name, N. DeLuca. And a number, nothing else. "You're wasted hiding behind this uniform," he said. He held the card out. She took it, because not taking it would have required an explanation she didn't have yet. "When you're ready to stop being invisible," he said, "call me." He turned and walked back into the room and was absorbed into the geometry of expensive conversation as if he'd never left it, and Vivian stood holding the black card and feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not excitement, not hope. Those were too large and too easy. Something smaller and more dangerous, the precise sensation of being accurately seen. She put the card in her jacket pocket and finished the event. At 11:15, the last guest departed. The cleanup crew moved in. Vivian did her final walk, checked her sheets, confirmed vendor sign-off, and took the elevator down 43 floors to the lobby. The doorman wished her a good evening. She walked out onto the sidewalk into the cold midtown air. She almost called it a night. She came very close. She took out her phone to call a car and instead found a text from Miles. He said they should talk when she got home. He said he was sorry for how the morning had gone. He said he wanted to be more honest with her. She stared at the message for a long time in the light from a street lamp, and something went quiet inside her, the specific quiet of a decision being made in a part of herself she'd stopped consulting. She didn't call a car home. She walked 4 blocks to the mid-price hotel she knew Miles sometimes used for afternoon meetings. The kind of knowing that accumulates in a marriage not from suspicion, but from proximity, from the small operational details a person absorbs about another person's movements over years. And she stood across the street looking up at the building's facade, and then she went inside and asked the front desk for Miles Grayson's room. The woman at the desk said they couldn't confirm guest information. Vivian said, "Tell him his wife is downstairs." The phone rang. A minute passed. 2. Then the elevator opened and Miles stepped out wearing his shirt untucked and an expression she'd never seen before on his face. Not guilt exactly, more the specific look of a person who has been caught, not in a lie, but in their actual life, the life they've been building in the space between. He said her name. She held up her phone. She'd photographed him stepping off the elevator. She said, "I'm going to need you to go get your things." He said, "Vivian." She said, "Not tonight, not here. Go back upstairs." Her voice didn't shake. She was genuinely surprised by that. "I'll be at an attorney's office by Thursday. You should do the same." She turned and walked back through the lobby and out into the street and kept walking. She walked for a long time. Brooklyn, then back across the bridge, then down through streets she'd been walking her whole adult life, past storefronts and bodegas and apartment windows with their blue television light and the occasional insomniac walking a dog, and the city did what it always did, which was to keep moving regardless, indifferent and enormous and strangely comforting in its refusal to stop for anyone's particular pain. Around 2 in the morning, she sat on a bench near the water in Brooklyn Bridge Park and looked at the Manhattan skyline reflected in the East River, that jagged lit edge of the city she'd spent years organizing herself around. And she took the black card out of her pocket and held it in the light. N. DeLuca. She thought about his voice. Not warm, not soft. The voice of someone who had decided something and saw no reason to dress it up. You're wasted hiding behind this uniform. Not you're beautiful, or you're interesting, or any of the language that men used when they wanted something from a woman. Something cleaner and more unsettling. A statement about what he'd observed. A statement that treated her as a subject worth observing. She'd given 6 years to a man who'd stopped seeing her. One night, and a stranger she'd exchanged 12 words with had seen her more clearly than anyone had in years. She turned the card over once, put it back in her pocket. She didn't call the number. Not that night. But somewhere between the bench and the walk home and the apartment she entered alone at 3:47 in the morning, she had already shifted. Some deep tectonic thing, quiet and invisible to anyone watching. The kind of movement that looks like nothing until the surface finally cracks. She sat in the kitchen with the lights off. Miles hadn't come home. She made coffee she didn't drink and stared at the water stain she'd never gotten around to reporting, and thought about the fact that she had a degree she wasn't using, a talent she'd folded and placed in storage, a version of herself she'd essentially agreed to leave behind for someone who had, in the end, been doing the same thing to her. The black card sat on the table. At 4:12 in the morning, she opened a text message to the number. She stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. She typed 4 words, deleted them, typed them again. I'm ready. Now what? She stared at it. She pressed send before she could reason herself out of it. Then she put the phone face down on the table and pressed her palms flat against the surface and breathed. The reply came in 4 minutes. Coffee. Tomorrow. Tribeca. Come alone. Vivian sat very still in the dark kitchen of the apartment that had been slowly ceasing to be her home, and for the first time in 6 years she felt the specific and terrifying feeling of something beginning. She had no idea what she was walking into. She would walk into it anyway. The Tribeca Cafe was the kind of place that didn't have a sign outside. No menu in the window, a single brushed steel door set into a limestone facade on a block that looked from the street like it had been quietly evacuated of anything meant for ordinary people. Vivian stood in front of it at 8:53 in the morning, wearing the only blazer she owned that wasn't part of her work uniform, charcoal, fitted, bought 2 years ago for a job interview she'd talked herself out of attending. And she had the specific physical sensation of someone standing at the edge of something that doesn't have a visible bottom. She pushed the door open. Inside, the cafe was small and almost aggressively calm. 6 tables, pale oak floors. The smell of very good coffee and something baked with cardamom. A woman behind the bar who looked at Vivian the way people look at someone they've been told to expect. She said nothing. She gestured to a table near the back window where the light came in at a low winter angle and made everything look like a photograph of itself. Nico DeLuca was already there. He was reading something on his phone, one hand wrapped around an espresso, and he didn't look up immediately when she sat down. Not rudeness. She understood that instinctively. More like a man who had decided that the meeting would begin on his terms, and who had the particular patience of someone who'd never once in his adult life been made to wait for anything he actually wanted. He put the phone away. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her the night before, that same quality of attention, measured and complete, like he was reading something written in a language most people couldn't see. He said, "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," she said. "Good." He picked up his espresso. People who sleep well before a first meeting like this aren't paying close enough attention. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. A small cup of coffee appeared in front of her from somewhere. She wrapped both hands around it. He set a single manila folder on the table between them. He didn't open it. He left it there like an object that had its own gravity and said, "I know where you went to school. I know your thesis topic. I know your graduation ranking. I know you've been working at Hargrove for 3 years doing work that requires approximately 40% of your actual capability. He paused. I know about Miles Grayson. I know the name of the woman he's been with for 4 months. I know you photographed him at the hotel last night. The air in Vivian's lungs went thin. She set her coffee down. Her voice came out flat and controlled, and she was proud of that. You investigated me. I investigate everyone. Before or after you handed me your card? Before. No apology in it, no softening. I don't make impulsive decisions about people. You decided to investigate me based on watching me fix a table at a party. Based on watching you fix a table that 6 other people had walked past for 3 hours, he said. There's a difference. She looked at the folder. She didn't touch it. What's in there? The structural plans for a hotel I'm building in Midtown. 41 stories, flagship property. It opens in 9 months. He leaned back slightly the first time he'd moved since she sat down. The design team I've had on it for 14 months has produced something that will be forgotten before it opens. Competent, safe, expensive wallpaper. He looked at her steadily. I watched you redesign a catering platform in real time last night to correct a structural imbalance 3 senior engineers had missed. I want to know what you do with something that actually matters. Vivian stared at him. She said, I'm an event coordinator. You're a designer who's been doing penance for 6 years, he said. That's not the same thing. Something moved in her chest. Not warmth, something more jagged than that. The specific pain of being correctly diagnosed by someone who has no reason to be gentle about it. She pulled the folder toward her. She opened it. The plans were dense. Architectural drawings, elevation specs, materials callouts, interior flow diagrams. The kind of documentation that would take most people an hour to orient to. Vivian's eyes moved through it the way hands move through familiar water, reading gradient and current without having to think about the mechanics. By the 2nd page, she could feel what was wrong. By the 4th page, she was certain. She looked up. Your ballroom's dead. He said nothing, waiting. The ceiling height is correct, but the volume ratio is off. The room will absorb sound unevenly, and the acoustics will make every event feel like it's happening in a corporate conference center. And this, she turned the plan toward him, pointed at the circulation diagram. Your main arrival sequence funnels guests into a bottleneck 12 feet from the entry. First impression of the entire property, and you've created a compression point. On a busy night, guests will feel crowded before they've taken their coats off. She turned another page. The rooftop terrace is oriented northwest. You're paying for a Manhattan skyline view, and you've positioned the primary guest sightline toward New Jersey. Nico looked at her for a long moment. He said, My lead architect has 22 years of experience. Your lead architect designed a beautiful building, she said. I'm telling you what it will feel like to be inside it. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the silence of a man testing someone. The silence of a man who has just received information that confirms something he suspected and isn't entirely comfortable with how much it confirms it. He said, What do you need to fix it? She almost laughed. I haven't said yes to anything. Experience in projects this scale can be taught, he said, as if she hadn't spoken. Creative instinct can't be purchased. I know which one I can replace and which one I can't. He named a number. A monthly number. She heard it and her body went very still. It was more than double her current salary. Full creative authority over every public space. Final approval on materials, lighting, furniture specification, and atmospheric design. You answer to me and no one beneath me. He picked up his coffee again. You have until Monday. She closed the folder. She thought about her gray uniform, about 3 years of other people's events, about a thesis her advisor had called remarkable that was sitting in a storage box in the closet of an apartment she was about to leave, about the fact that every single time in the last 6 years she'd been on the verge of doing something for herself, she'd found a reason, a good reason, a responsible reason, to step back. She said, Why me? Genuinely. You have money. You could hire anyone. He looked at her without hesitation. Because most designers walk into a room and see what they want to create. You walked into a room last night and saw what was wrong before anyone asked you to look. Bom batris mosam, he set his cup down. I don't need someone who can execute a vision. I need someone who can't stop themselves from seeing the truth about a space even when it's inconvenient. He stood, buttoning his jacket with the precise economy of a man who never makes unnecessary movements. Monday, he said. Think carefully. He walked out. The woman behind the bar materialized to clear his cup, and Vivian sat alone in the low winter light, with the folder in front of her, and the number still ringing inside her skull like a bell that had been struck in a very quiet room. She took the subway back to Brooklyn. She sat in the rattling car and held the folder in her lap, and watched a teenage boy across the aisle fall asleep against the window, his head lolling gently with the motion of the train, completely unconscious and completely trusting of the movement beneath him. And she thought about what that felt like, to be moved by something and not be afraid of it. She went to the apartment. Miles wasn't there. He'd been there and left. She could tell from the bedroom, a drawer left open, a specific jacket missing from the hook by the door, the bathroom counter rearranged. He'd taken things, not many things. Enough things to communicate a decision had been made, even if no one had yet articulated it out loud. She stood in the middle of the living room and looked at the space she'd spent 3 years making livable. The art on the walls she'd chosen. The lamp in the corner she'd found at a flea market in Red Hook and rewired herself. The bookshelf she'd assembled alone one Saturday afternoon while Miles was at a pitch meeting. Small acts of making. Small acts of refusing to entirely disappear, even when everything else was asking her to. She took out her phone. She called her attorney. Not a divorce attorney. She didn't have one of those. She called the only lawyer whose number she had, a woman who handled contracts for Hargrove, and asked for a recommendation. The recommendation came through in an hour. By midday, she had an appointment for Thursday morning. At 2 p.m, Miles came back. He stood in the doorway with his key still in his hand, as if he wasn't sure whether to come the rest of the way in. He looked at her, and she could see him calculating. Reading the room, reading her, trying to determine which version of this conversation was available to him. He said, "We need to talk." "We do," she said, "but not the way you mean." He sat down on the couch. He laced his hands together. He said her name once in the tone of a man who was about to explain something to her, and something in her went cold and very still. She said, "How long?" He said, "Viv, how long, Miles?" The pause was 3 seconds. She counted. He said, 4 months. She'd known. She'd known from the moment she stood in the hotel lobby and watched the elevator open. But hearing it was different from knowing it. Hearing it had a physical component, a specific pressure behind the sternum, not grief exactly, more the feeling of something that had been suspended finally making contact with the ground. She said, "The conversation this morning, the open marriage conversation." He looked at the floor. She said, "You weren't asking me for something new. You were asking me to retroactively approve something you'd already been doing." He didn't answer. That was the answer. She stood up. She went to the closet and took out a bag. Not her largest. Not a bag that represented a decision about everything. Just a bag that represented the decision about tonight. She put clothes in it. She put her laptop in it. She put the folder from the Tribeca Cafe in it, slipping it in between her things with a care that surprised her, as if she already understood it was important. Miles watched her from the doorway of the bedroom. He said, "Where are you going?" "Somewhere else," she said. "You're not going to he started. "I have an attorney appointment Thursday," she said. She zipped the bag. She lifted it. "I'd recommend you get one too." She walked past him. He said her name again. Differently this time, not calculating, something raw underneath it, something that might have been genuine, and she stopped. She didn't turn around. She stood with her hand on the doorframe and her bag over her shoulder, and her back to 6 years of her own life, and she waited to feel something that would change her mind. She didn't feel it. She left. She called her friend Dara from the street, the only person she trusted enough to ask, and Dara, who had been watching Vivian's marriage from the outside for 3 years with the careful silence of someone who knows better than to say what they see, simply said, "I have the couch and a bottle of something serious. Come now." Vivian went. She sat in Dara's apartment in Crown Heights and drank 1 glass of something that tasted like oak and smoke and didn't say much. Dara didn't push. That was what she loved most about Dara. She understood that some grief needed to sit in the room for a while before it was ready to be talked about. Around midnight, Vivian told her about the meeting, about Nico, about the number, about the folder. Dara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "A Korean-American mafia boss offered you a job. He runs hotels. And other things, apparently. I don't know that for certain." "Vivian?" Dara looked at her with the specific expression of a woman who has spent significant time being honest with someone who doesn't always want honesty. "You know." Vivian looked at her glass. "The design work is real. The hotel is real. I looked up the development filing. It's been in planning commission records for 2 years. It's legitimate construction." The design work being real and the man offering it being complicated are not mutually exclusive things, Dara said. "No," Vivian said. "They're not." They sat with that for a while. Outside, Crown Heights settled into its late-night register. A car with bass-heavy music rolling past, someone on a stoop 3 buildings down laughing about something, the ambient pulse of a city that never fully goes to sleep. Dara said, "What do you want to do?" Vivian thought about the ballroom plans, the rooftop orientation, the arrival sequence, and the compression point 12 feet from the front door. She thought about the feeling of reading those plans, the way her mind had moved through them, automatic and certain, like a language she hadn't spoken in years that came back without effort, the moment she opened her mouth. She thought about the 22-year-old who'd written a thesis on sensory layering and believed, without question, that she was going to build things that mattered. "I want to call him," she said. Dara nodded once. "Then call him." Vivian picked up her phone. It was 12:37 in the morning. She found the number. She typed, "I accept. I'm not waiting until Monday." She pressed send. She set the phone on the cushion beside her. 14 seconds passed. She counted without meaning to, and then the reply came. "My office. Monday, 8 a.m. sharp. My assistant will send you the address and the ND as tonight." And then after a pause that felt considered rather than accidental, "Get some sleep, Ms. Hale. You start tomorrow whether you're ready or not." Vivian read the message twice. Something moved through her. Not safety, not rescue, nothing as simple as relief. Something more like the feeling of stepping from a stationary platform onto something that is already moving, that has its own speed and direction and will not slow down for her, and the specific terror and exhilaration of choosing to step onto it anyway. She slept better than she had in 3 years. Monday morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of February morning that turns every surface in Manhattan into a mirror. Vivian wore her best blazer, not the charcoal one, a deeper one, almost black, with clean lines that she'd bought on sale 2 years ago and worn exactly once. She wore it like a decision. The DeLuca International offices occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in Hudson Yards. The lobby had the particular atmosphere of serious money, not ostentatious, something more controlled than that, the kind of design that communicates power by removing everything unnecessary. She gave her name at the desk. A woman in a gray suit appeared, introduced herself as Petra, and led Vivian to an elevator that required a key card. The executive floor was quieter than she expected. The kind of quiet that happens in places where people understand that noise is a sign of inefficiency. Petra brought her to a conference room with a wall of glass overlooking the Hudson and left her with a stack of documents, the NDAs, standard in form but thorough in scope, and a pen. Vivian read every page. She signed. Nico came in at 8:03. He was followed by 2 people she would come to know as his lead architect, a tall woman named Soren, with close-cropped hair and the expression of someone who has been told their work is being reconsidered and has not yet decided how to feel about it, and a project manager named Rael, who was compact and watchful and said almost nothing during the entire meeting, just took notes in a small leather-bound book with the dedication of a court reporter. Nico sat at the head of the table. He looked at Vivian. He said, "Tell me everything that's wrong." She had been in the room for 6 minutes. She had not been offered coffee. She had not been given a presentation or a briefing or any of the orientation scaffolding that most organizations use to make new people feel prepared before asking them to perform. She understood that this was intentional. She opened the folder. She placed the ballroom elevation on the table. She said, "Start here. Soren went rigid immediately. Vivian could see it in her shoulders. The tightening, the professional ego rousing itself like an animal that's been poked. But Vivian didn't look at Soren. She looked at the plans and she talked about what she saw. And she talked about it the way she'd been trained to talk about it. Not as criticism, but as diagnosis. With the specific detached authority of someone who is not interested in who drew the lines, but only in what the lines will produce when turned into physical reality. She talked for 40 minutes. When she stopped, the table was covered with her annotations. Sketches, notation, revised proportions, a complete rerouting of the arrival sequence that moved the bottleneck entirely, a reorientation of the rooftop terrace that turned the sightline 45 degrees east to center the Empire State Building in the primary view corridor. The room was very quiet. Soren said, "These changes would require renegotiating with 3 contractors and adding 6 weeks to the timeline." Vivian said, "Or 8 weeks of a mediocre opening and 30 years of a forgettable building." Soren looked at Nico. Nico had not moved during the 40 minutes. He'd sat with his hands flat on the table and watched Vivian the way she'd watched him walk into the Castellano Gala, with the precise, complete attention of someone running an assessment that they intend to take seriously. He said to Soren, "Get me revised contractor schedules by Wednesday." He stood. He looked at Vivian. "You have an office. Petra will show you." He paused at the door. "Welcome to DeLuca International, Ms. Hale. Try to keep up." Bull. He left. Rael followed. Soren remained at the table for a moment, looking at the annotated plans with an expression that was difficult to read. Professional displeasure and something underneath it that might eventually become respect if Vivian gave it enough time and enough proof. Soren said without looking up, "The ballroom ceiling change alone is going to cost $400,000. Vivian said, "What does a ballroom that sounds like a conference center cost you in repeat bookings over 10 years? Soren said nothing. She gathered the plans and walked out. Vivian sat alone in the conference room with the Hudson spread out silver and immense below her, and the annotated plans spread across the table in the specific, buzzing, almost frightening feeling of a person who has just done something they were always capable of doing and is only now beginning to understand what the cost of not doing it has been. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. A 4-worded photo. No caption. It was of her. Taken last night outside Dara's building, from across the street, the angle suggesting a long lens. She was standing in the light from the front entrance, her bag over her shoulder, her face visible and clear. She stared at the image for a long time. She looked at the sender. Unknown number. A second message arrived 15 seconds later. The words were 4 of them, and they landed in her chest like something thrown from a great height. "He's watching you, Vivian." Vivian stared at the message for 31 seconds. She counted without meaning to, the way you count things when your brain needs something mechanical to hold on to while the rest of it processes something it doesn't want to process. "He's watching you, Vivian." She screenshot it. She went to her contacts and added the unknown number under a placeholder name, a single letter. A habit she'd developed during the 3 years of managing events, where you needed to track every variable even before you understood what it was. She put her phone face down on the conference table. She picked it up again. She looked at the photograph a second time, the angle, the distance, the fact that whoever had taken it had been across the street and above street level, a second-floor window or a parked van with an elevated platform, somewhere with a clear line of sight to Dara's front entrance. Miles. She didn't have proof yet, but she knew the shape of it the same way she'd known the shape of the hotel's dead ballroom from the 4th page of the plans, not from evidence, but from the accumulated instinct of someone who understands how certain kinds of neglect arrange themselves into pattern. She put the phone in her bag. She stood up from the conference table. She straightened the annotated plans into a stack, aligned the corners with the automatic precision of someone who organizes physical space as a way of managing what she can't control. And she carried them out of the conference room and down the hall to find Petra and locate the office that was apparently hers now. The office was on the northeast corner of the floor. It had a window that looked out over the Hudson and a glass interior wall that looked into the open workspace where the design and development team sat. It was small by executive standards, but large by the standards of every space Vivian had occupied professionally for the last 3 years. Someone had placed a set of architectural markers on the desk and a fresh roll of trace paper. Either Petra or Nico had anticipated that she would need to draw immediately. She sat down. She unrolled the trace paper. She began drawing. She did not think about the photograph. She let her hands move and she let the thinking happen underneath. In the place where decisions get made before they surface as conscious thought. And she drew for 2 hours while the office around her gradually populated with the sound of a large organization moving through its Monday. At 11, Petra knocked and brought coffee and the revised contractor contact list. At 11:40, Rael appeared in the doorway with a scheduling question about the materials review meeting and stayed for 20 minutes discussing the rooftop glass specification with the focused, undramatic competence of someone who had apparently decided that Vivian's presence was a fact to be worked with rather than a position to be taken on. At 12:30, nobody brought her to lunch and she didn't expect them to. She ate a granola bar from her bag and kept working. Soren did not appear. That was information. At 2:15, Nico walked past her office without stopping, glanced through the glass wall at her trace paper drawings, and kept walking. 40 seconds later, he came back and stood in the doorway. He said, "The rooftop revision. The glass parapet needs to go to 60 inches, she said without looking up. Current spec is 42. You lose the wind buffer, and every event on that terrace after 9 p.m. in September through April becomes a problem the client blames on the venue." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a structural amendment. It's an 8-inch addition to an existing parapet on a completed concrete pour," she said. "It's inconvenient. It's not structural." She looked up. "The difference between inconvenient and structural is about $200,000 and your client's comfort for the next 40 years. He looked at the drawings. He said, "Soren is going to push back." "Soren pushes back on everything I touch," Vivian said. "That's fine. She should. I'd rather have someone fight me on the details than agree with everything and deliver something mediocre." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, something more like recognition. He said, "Have Rael put the parapet revision in the Wednesday materials package." He turned to leave. She said, "I got a photograph this morning. Someone outside my friend's building last night. Long lens." He stopped. He turned back slowly. She said, "And a text. Unknown number, 4 words." She picked up her phone and showed him. He looked at the screen for a long moment. He did not reach for it. He read the message from where he stood, and then he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not concern exactly, more the look of a man who has just had a calculation updated, who is running the new numbers in real time. He said, "Is there anyone who would want to make you feel unsafe?" She said, "My ex-husband found out I left last night, and I'm now sitting in your building." He said, "Miles Grayson." She said, "Probably." He nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone filing information into a place where it will be retrieved and acted upon at the appropriate moment. He said, "Don't respond to the number. Don't go anywhere alone after dark for the next week. Tell Petra your schedule." He paused. "And get me the parapet spec by tomorrow morning." He left. She sat for a moment with the precise feeling of a woman who has just handed a problem to someone who will handle it with a thoroughness she can't entirely predict, and who is not sure whether that is a relief or a different category of complication. She decided it was both. She went back to drawing. The weeks that followed had a particular rhythm, dense, fast, and completely consuming in the way that only genuine work can be. The kind that takes everything you have and gives back something you didn't know was available. She arrived at DeLuca International before 8 every morning and rarely left before 7 in the evening. The hotel design unfolded in layers, each decision unlocking 3 more, each problem containing inside it the seed of a solution that was usually better than what had been planned before the problem existed. She redesigned the ballroom ceiling and the acoustic panels behind it. She rerouted the arrival sequence and opened a secondary viewing corridor that turned the walk from the lobby to the main dining space into an experiential transition. A shift in light and material and ceiling height that made guests feel, without being able to say why, that they had entered somewhere that understood them. She specified furniture that looked expensive in photographs and felt expensive under the body, the specific intersection that most luxury designers failed to maintain simultaneously. She chose stone for the main bar that took 3 weeks to source and was worth every week. Soren fought her on the ceiling. She was right about the ceiling. Soren fought her on the stone. She was right about the stone. By the fourth week, Soren had stopped fighting and started asking questions. Not deferential questions, the pointed technical questions of someone who is genuinely trying to understand a design logic they hadn't previously encountered. It was better than deference. It meant the work was real. The construction managers, initially skeptical of a woman with no project-scale experience, became her most reliable allies after she spent an afternoon on the construction floor with the lead foreman, Marcus, a man with 30 years of site experience who said almost nothing for the first 2 hours, and then, when she correctly identified a load-bearing miscalculation in the mezzanine framing by looking at the pour from below, said, "All right, you know things." After that, Marcus answered her calls on the first ring. With Nico, it was different. Their working relationship had a specific texture. Challenging, direct, often combative, in the way that ideas become combative when two people are both convinced they're right and neither is willing to pretend otherwise. He pushed back on her materials costs. She pushed back on his timeline compression. He questioned her rooftop furniture specification. She produced a 20-minute presentation on why the specification was correct that left the entire design team silent for a moment before he said simply, "Change the throw pillows on the corner seating and it's approved." She changed the throw pillows. She was right about everything else, but there were moments, small ones, arriving without announcement, when the combative rhythm paused and something else moved into the space it left. A late Thursday evening, when the last of the team had gone home and they were both still in the design room, and she was revising the grand foyer specification, and he was going through acquisition documents at the other end of the table, and neither of them spoke for almost an hour. And the silence was not the silence of two people ignoring each other, but the silence of two people who are fully present in the same space and don't need to fill it. She noticed it. She didn't say anything about it. She was still living out of Dara's couch until the second week, when a message came from an unknown sender, not the same unknown number, a different one, with the address and access code for an apartment in Battery Park. Furnished. Lease prepaid for 3 months. Hudson Views. She called Nico. She said, "Did you rent me an apartment?" He said, "You need a place to work from that isn't your friend's living room." She said, "That's not something you needed to do." He said, "I'm aware." She moved in the next day. She didn't say thank you. She understood, instinctively, that he hadn't done it to be thanked. He'd done it because it was efficient, because a designer who is sleeping on a couch is a designer running at reduced capacity, and Nico DeLuca did not run anything at reduced capacity. She understood that. She chose to understand only that. The divorce proceedings moved forward with the speed of things that have been long in coming and need very little ceremony to conclude. Miles had hired an attorney. The split was cleaner than she expected. They had no children, no joint property, no shared business. The marriage had been funded primarily by Miles's startup income and Vivian's coordinating salary in a proportion that left her, legally, with significantly less than she'd contributed in the intangible currency of sustained support and invisible management of their shared life. Her attorney said she could fight for more. Vivian said to close it cleanly and quickly. She had stopped trying to quantify what she'd lost to that marriage. You couldn't recover the intangible from someone who didn't believe it had existed. The photographs appeared on a Tuesday. She was in a review meeting with Soren and 2 contractors when Rael came to the door and gestured to her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not urgency, something more unsettled than that. A careful suppression of urgency that communicated it more clearly than urgency itself would have. She excused herself. Rael held out his phone. The tabloid page was already loaded. The headline was large, and the photograph was the one taken outside Dara's building. Her face clear, the DeLuca International building visible in the background of a separate inset image. And the text beneath it used words like secret mistress and billionaire's kept designer and career built on more than talent, in the particular way of publications that have learned to frame insinuation as inquiry. She stood in the hallway outside the meeting room and read it once, then a second time. Then she handed Rael's phone back to him and stood for a moment with her hands at her sides and breathed through her nose, the specific, disciplined breathing of someone managing a physical response that wants to be something larger and more visible than they're going to allow it to be. She went back into the meeting. She sat down. She said to Soren, "The marble specification for the main corridor, I want to revisit the vein direction on the book match panels before we finalize the order." Soren blinked at her. Vivian said, "The vein direction. Let's look at the sample again." They looked at the sample. The meeting continued. By afternoon, 3 more publications had run variations of the same story. By evening, her name was producing search results she had never generated in her life. Not for her work, not for her talent, not for any of the things she'd spent 6 weeks pouring herself into a building to produce. Her name was generating results about who she was sleeping with, about whether she'd earned her position, about the specific and ancient and exhausting question that powerful women in proximity to powerful men are always eventually required to answer, which is whether the proximity preceded the power or the power created the proximity, as if the answer changes the value of the work. Her phone ran out of storage from the screenshot notifications. She turned the notifications off. She was in her Battery Park apartment, sitting on the floor with the floor plan spread around her because the table was too small, when Nico arrived. He knocked twice. She opened the door and he came in and looked at the plans on the floor, and then at her and said nothing for a moment. She said, "You saw." He said, "An hour ago." She said, "Miles sent them the photograph." He said, "My team confirmed it 40 minutes ago." He came in and sat on the couch and looked at her with the steady, assessing attention she'd come to understand as his default mode when something required a decision. He's working with a former colleague at a media group. He gave them the photograph and a narrative. They ran it without verification because it was already internally consistent: proximity to money, rapid advancement, convenient relationship. She said, "It's not a relationship." The words came out more quickly than she intended, and they landed in the room with a particular sound, the sound of a truth being stated defensively, which is the sound of a truth that the speaker isn't entirely certain about. She heard it. She thought he heard it too. He said, "That's not the issue right now." She said, "What is the issue?" He said, "The story will compound. The first piece is the frame. Everything that comes after will be fitted to it. In 3 days, there will be a follow-up asking construction sources whether your work reflects genuine expertise or relationship access. In a week, there will be an opinion piece about what your hiring says about accountability and luxury development." He paused. "The question is whether you want to respond to the frame or replace it." She said, "How?" He said, "Interview. Rebecca Holt at Manhattan Architecture Review. She's been asking for access to the hotel project for 6 months. We give her access. We give her you. We give her the design work, the process, the specific decisions and their technical justification. We let the work answer the question." Vivian said, "Or I step back publicly, remove the personal proximity story." Nico said, "No." The word was flat. Final. Delivered the way he delivered most things. Without drama, but with the particular weight of someone who has already considered all the available positions and is not offering a debate. She said, "It would protect the project." He said, "The project doesn't need protecting. It needs completion. And the moment we treat your presence here as a liability that needs managing, we've already told everyone who's asking the question that the question had merit." He looked at her directly. "You stay. You work. You give the interview. And then you go back to fixing the building." She looked at him for a long moment. The apartment was quiet around them. Through the window, the Hudson moved in the dark with its own enormous indifference. She said, "Why does it matter to you whether I'm protected in this?" He said, "Because you've earned the right to be here, and I'm not in the habit of letting other people's bad behavior define what happens inside my organization." It wasn't the whole answer. They both knew it wasn't the whole answer, but it was the answer that was available in that room on that night, and she decided to accept it. He left at 10. She locked the door and stood in the middle of the apartment and looked at the floor plans and thought about the interview and about Miles and about the specific exhaustion of being a woman who has to continually prove that her competence is not a byproduct of her relationships, that her relationships are not a byproduct of her need for advancement, that the two things exist in the same life without one being the explanation for the other. She sat back down on the floor. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. The Rebecca Holt interview ran 12 days later, on a Wednesday, in a 1,500-word piece accompanied by photographs of the hotel construction site and Vivian's original annotated drawings. Drawings that Holt, who had covered luxury architecture for 11 years, described in the article as reflecting a level of spatial intelligence that the development community had apparently been sitting on top of without realizing it. Former professors were quoted, a professor from her Boston program who had taught her thesis seminar, said on record that Vivian Hale had been one of the most technically gifted students he'd taught in 22 years. An architect who'd competed against her graduating class said the design logic in the hotel's arrival sequence was the work of someone who thought about space as a psychological instrument rather than a visual one. The industry began to shift. But Miles was not done. She came to the hotel site on a Friday morning in March, arriving at 7:15 as she did every Friday for the weekly construction review, and Marcus met her in the lobby with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the controlled competence he wore for site problems, something underneath it, something that had been there since before she arrived. He said, "You need to see the ballroom." She followed him through the construction corridor and through the heavy fire door into the ballroom space, and she stopped. The walls were red. Not paint from the construction, not an accident. Someone had come through the ballroom during the night and covered every surface they could reach in red paint, rolling it across the fresh plaster, spraying it across the acoustic panels she'd spent 4 weeks sourcing, writing across the bottom of the wall nearest the stage in letters that were large and deliberately legible. The words said, "This building was built on lies." And beneath that, in different handwriting, the same 3 words repeated in multiple places: "She doesn't belong." Vivian stood in the middle of the ballroom and looked at it. She looked at the acoustic panels, ruined. She looked at the plaster, which had been applied last week and was not yet fully cured and would need to be redone entirely. She looked at the stage flooring, which had been sprayed and would need replacing. She looked at the paint on the marble samples she'd positioned along the east wall for the final material review scheduled for this afternoon. Marcus said quietly, "Security footage cut out at 2 a.m. Someone knew the system." She said, "How many people knew the camera schedule?" He said, "On paper, 12. In practice, anyone who spent enough time on site to notice the rotation pattern." She turned slowly in the middle of the ruined room. She looked at every surface. She breathed through her mouth because the paint smell was thick and chemical, and the ventilation system wasn't running at full capacity yet. She stood there for a long time. Then she took out her phone and called Nico. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "I need you at the site." She said it without preface, without apology, without the instinct she'd once had to soften bad news before delivering it. He said, "What happened?" She said, "The ballroom." She paused. "We're not delaying. I need you to understand that before you see it. We are not delaying." There was a brief silence. Then he said, "I'm 20 minutes away." She hung up. She looked at Marcus. She said, "Call the plastering crew. Call the acoustic panel supplier. I need to know if a rush replacement order is possible before I talk to Nico. And get me the security company on the phone. I want to know exactly how someone walked into this building at 2 in the morning, and I want to know it before 9 o'clock. Marcus looked at her for a moment, not with the skepticism he'd started with weeks ago, something entirely different now. Something that sat closer to the expression of a man who has been waiting to see what a person is made of and has just received his answer. He said, "On it." He walked away. Vivienne turned back to the ruined ballroom. She stood alone in the red-soaked room with the chemical smell thick in the air around her, and she looked at the words on the wall. "She doesn't belong." And she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not devastation and not rage, but something colder and more precise than either. The specific, clarifying anger of a person who has just understood exactly what they're fighting and has decided, without ceremony or hesitation, that they are going to win. Nico arrived at 7:42. Vivienne heard him before she saw him. The specific quality of footsteps that belong to a man who moves with purpose through spaces he owns. Steady and unhurried, even when the situation warrants neither. He came through the fire door with Rael 2 steps behind, and he stopped in the entrance of the ballroom and looked at what had been done to it. He didn't speak for a long moment. Vivienne watched him take it in. The red walls, the ruined panels, the words written in large, deliberate letters across the plaster. She watched his jaw set and his hands go still at his sides, and she understood, watching him, that what she was seeing was not anger being suppressed, but anger being categorized, filed into the precise internal system of a man who had learned long ago that emotion was most useful when it was organized rather than expressed. He said, "Security footage." She said, "Cut at 2 a.m. Someone knew the rotation." He turned to Rael. Something passed between them. Not words, a look that had the compressed information content of a conversation that had been had before in different rooms about different situations, but with the same essential architecture. Rael took out his phone and walked back through the fire door. Nico looked at the words on the wall. He said, "Miles." She said, "Has to be. The tabloid photographs. Now this, it's the same campaign, just different instruments." He walked into the room slowly, his shoes marking the concrete floor, looking at the panels and the plaster and the marble samples along the east wall with the red paint dried across their faces. He crouched down and touched the edge of one sample with one finger and looked at the paint residue and stood back up. He said, "What do you need?" She said, "The plastering crew is already called. I need a rush order on the acoustic panels. Supplier response by 9. And I need to know if we can recover the marble samples or if I need to reorder." She paused. "I also need the construction schedule open on your screen because I want to show you how we absorb this without adding a single day to the timeline." He looked at her. She said, "We are not delaying." He said, "I heard you the first time." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. "Show me the schedule." They spent 40 minutes at a folding table Marcus set up in the construction corridor. The plans spread between them. Vivian walking through the revised sequencing with the focused velocity of someone who had already been running the numbers in her head since the moment she'd walked into the ruined ballroom. She moved the panel installation to overlap with the plaster cure time. She pushed the marble review to the following week using substitute samples she could source from the supplier's showroom by Tuesday. She restructured the acoustic treatment timeline to run concurrently with the stage floor replacement rather than sequentially. When she finished, Nico looked at the revised schedule for a moment. He said, "This works." She said, "I know." He said, "Marcus?" The foreman materialized from somewhere in the construction corridor. "Get the plastering crew here by 10. Everything else goes through Vivian directly." He looked at her. "I'll have the security company replaced by end of day. New system, new rotation, camera redundancy on every entrance." He paused. "And I'm putting 2 of my people on the building overnight until this is closed." She knew what "my people" meant in the specific register Nico used when he said it with that particular flatness. She didn't ask for clarification. She nodded. By 9 o'clock, the ballroom was full of noise and movement. Plasterers, a cleaning crew working on the marble samples with chemical solvents, Marcus coordinating with the efficiency of a man who had decided that the destruction of the previous night was simply a problem to be solved and had no interest in treating it as anything more significant than that. Vivian moved through it all, directing, deciding, answering questions before they became problems. At 9:40, Rael appeared at her elbow. He said quietly, "We have something on the footage." She followed him to the side office, a temporary room off the main corridor with a folding table and a laptop and 2 monitors running security feeds. A man she hadn't seen before was seated at the laptop. He had the specific physical economy of someone whose professional training included the efficient use of small spaces and minimal movement. He didn't introduce himself. He turned the laptop toward her. The footage was from a camera mounted on the building across the street, not the hotel's own security system, which had been cut, but a traffic monitoring camera that covered the intersection. The angle was wide and the resolution was modest, but it was sufficient. At 1:58 in the morning, a panel van had parked on the service alley adjacent to the hotel's east entrance. 2 figures in dark clothing had moved from the van to the entrance. One of them had used a key card on the service door. A key card. She said, "Who has service door access?" The man at the laptop said, "As of last week, 19 people. Construction management, senior design staff, delivery coordinators, 2 executives." He paused. "And 1 external vendor who was issued a temporary card 6 weeks ago for after-hours material delivery and whose access was never revoked." She said, "Name." He said, "The vendor company is registered to a holding LLC. The LLC was incorporated 8 months ago." He turned the laptop back toward himself, typed briefly, turned it back. "The registered agent for the LLC is a man named Curtis Vane. Mr. Vane has a prior professional relationship with your ex-husband's startup. They worked together for approximately 14 months, 2 years ago." The room was very quiet. She said, "Miles hired someone to get a card into the building." He said, "That would be the reasonable inference." She stood up straight. Her back ached. She'd been leaning over construction tables since 7, and the physical accumulation of a 6-week sprint on a project of this scale had started to live in her body in ways she didn't have time to address. She pressed one hand briefly against the base of her spine, a single private moment of acknowledging it, and then dropped her hand and looked at Rael. She said, "Nico needs to see this." Rael said, "He's already seen it. He asked me to show you." She thought about that for a moment, the specific order of it. Nico reviewing the evidence first and then sending it to her rather than bringing it himself. The communication inside that sequence, the trust it represented, and also the question it raised about what he intended to do with the information before she'd had a chance to weigh in. She said, "Where is he?" Rael said, "His office. He's been on the phone for the last 40 minutes. She said, "To who?" Rael looked at her with an expression that was not evasive but was careful. He said, "People who handle things." She understood what that meant too. She thought about it for 3 seconds. The specific 3 seconds in which a person decides how much they need to know about the mechanisms being employed on their behalf and whether the moral accounting of that knowledge is something they want to carry. She said, "Tell him I want to be in the room when he talks to Miles." Rael said, "He anticipated you'd say that." She said, "And?" Rael said, "He said Monday. He's arranging it." She went back to the ballroom. The weekend passed in the compressed non-time of a project in crisis recovery. Hours that felt simultaneously too long and inadequate. The site running on skeleton crew overtime while Vivian managed material deliveries and specification revisions and contractor communications from the Battery Park apartment with the floor plans spread around her and her phone perpetually warm in her hand. She slept in 4-hour stretches. She ate when she remembered. The work had the specific gravity of something she cared about in a way that superseded the normal human requirements for rest and regular meals, and she let it, because the alternative was to stop moving and feel the full weight of what the past 3 weeks had been. Saturday evening, Nico called. Not a text. A call, which was unusual enough that she picked up immediately. He said, "How is the panel installation tracking?" She said, "Crew finishes the east wall tomorrow afternoon. We're ahead." He said, "Good." A pause. "How are you?" She said, "I'm fine." He said, "Afin, Vivian." She said, "I'm tired and I'm angry and I'm fine. All three are true simultaneously." Another pause. Longer. She could hear something in the background, the low ambient sound of a large quiet space, the city through glass. He said, "The anger is useful. Don't lose it before Monday." She said, "I won't." He said, "Get some sleep." He paused one more time. "The work you've done on that building is something that will still be standing in 50 years. Nothing Miles Grayson does changes that." She said nothing for a moment. She said, "Good night, Nico." He said, "Good night." She put the phone down and sat with the quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of that sentence, the specific quality of the way he'd said her name, and the specific thing she was no longer going to pretend she didn't feel about it, which was something large and inconveniently timed and absolutely real. She went back to work. Monday arrived cold and pewter gray, a sky that had been threatening snow for a week without committing to it. Vivian was at DeLuca International by 7:30. She went directly to Nico's office. He was already there, jacket on, standing at the window with a coffee he hadn't been drinking. He turned when she came in. He looked at her once, a full assessment, the way he always looked at her when something important was about to happen. He said, "Miles agreed to come." She said, "Why would he agree?" He said, "Because my attorney sent his attorney a letter this morning outlining the evidence we have regarding the security access, the vendor LLC, the traffic footage, and the tabloid transaction records." He paused. "And because the letter indicated that DeLuca International would be pursuing civil and criminal remedy unless Mr. Grayson elected to meet privately first." She said, "He's coming here." He said, "Conference room B, 11 o'clock. He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to be in the room." She said, "I'm going to be in the room." He said, "I know." They arrived at conference room B at 10:55. The room was one of the smaller ones. No Hudson view, no glass wall, just a rectangular table and 6 chairs and the particular closed atmosphere of a room where private things get said and don't leave. Nico's attorney, a compact woman named Diane, who carried herself with the specific energy of someone who has been in more rooms like this than she could count, was already seated with a laptop and a thick folder. Miles arrived at 11:03. He looked worse than Vivian expected. Not physically damaged, he was dressed well, pressed and put together in the careful way of a man who understands that appearance is a form of argument. But something underneath it, some quality of the eyes, the specific flatness of a person who hasn't been sleeping or who has been sleeping too much, and neither has helped. He came in with his own attorney, a young man in a suit that was slightly too large, and he sat down and he looked at Vivian. She looked back at him. His attorney opened with a prepared statement about the preliminary nature of the allegations and the lack of direct evidentiary linkage. Diane let him finish. Then she opened her folder and placed 3 items on the table: a printed still from the traffic camera footage, a corporate registration document for the vendor, LLC, with Curtis Vane's name highlighted, and a transaction record from a digital payment platform showing a transfer of $9,000 from a personal account registered to Miles Grayson to Curtis Vane's LLC 6 weeks ago, 9 days before the ballroom vandalism. The young attorney stopped talking. Miles looked at the transaction record. Vivienne watched his face. She watched the specific sequence of it, the calculation, the assessment of available positions, the narrowing of options as the evidence accumulated on the table in front of him. She'd watched him do this before, in smaller rooms about smaller things, and she knew the rhythm of it, knew the moment when the calculation ended and something raw came through. Diane said, "We also have the communication records between Mr. Vane and a media contact at a tabloid group, which include forwarded photographs of Miss Hale that originated from a device registered to Mr. Grayson." She placed a 4th document on the table. "Mr. Vane has already been contacted by our investigators. He's been cooperative." Miles looked at Vivian, not at his attorney, at her. He said, "You brought him into this." She said, "You vandalized a construction site and ran a media campaign to destroy my career." He said, He stopped. He looked at the table. When he looked up again, the calculation was gone. What was left underneath it was something she recognized too, something she hadn't expected to recognize. Not guilt, something more primitive than guilt. The specific expression of a person who has been so completely consumed by their own narrative of grievance that they've managed to stop seeing themselves clearly. He said, "You left." She said, "You gave me a reason." He said, "You left and you went straight to him." She said, "I went straight to work." Her voice was level. She kept it level because the anger she'd been carrying for 3 weeks had refined itself into something cleaner and colder than heat, something that didn't need to be loud to be felt. The fact that you can't see the difference between those two things is the entire problem, Miles. It's been the problem for 6 years. You never saw what I did. You just saw what was adjacent to you. He said nothing. She said, "You sent a photographer to follow me. You paid someone to break into a building I'd spent 6 weeks rebuilding and destroy it. You called me a kept woman in public." She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to close the distance. "And the worst part is that you did all of it because you couldn't tolerate the idea that I was capable of this without you." The room was very quiet. Miles looked at the table. His attorney put a hand on his arm and whispered something, but Miles wasn't listening to him anymore. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere interior, and Vivian watched him arrive at whatever was in that place, and she felt, not pity, not satisfaction, something quieter than either, something that came from the specific exhaustion of having been angry at someone for a long time, and arriving, finally, at the place where the anger has consumed everything that was feeding it, and there is nothing left but the fact of it. Diane said, "Mr. Grayson, our position is straightforward. We're prepared to pursue criminal charges related to the vandalism, civil liability for damage to the construction project, and defamation proceedings related to the media campaign. Alternatively, you sign the agreement we've prepared, which includes full restitution for construction damages, a public correction issued through the same media contacts you used, and a legally binding cease and desist on any further contact or action regarding Ms. Hale or DeLuca International." "What's yours? Mom, Morstel." She paused. "You have until 5 o'clock today." Miles's attorney began a response. Miles put his hand flat on the table. He said, "Can I have a minute?" His attorney looked at him. He said louder, "A minute, please." His attorney and Diane both stood and moved toward the door. Nico stood. He looked at Vivian with a question in his eyes. Do you want me to stay? Do you want me to go? And she gave him a small nod, go, and he went, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. Vivian and Miles sat across from each other in the small room. The city existed outside, indifferent and enormous. Inside, the room had the specific stillness of a space where something is finally being said that should have been said years ago and has instead been accumulating in the walls. Miles said, I hated watching you succeed. She said, I know. He said, I hated it because... He stopped. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth for a moment. When he moved his hand, his voice was different. Because if you could do this, then I have to ask why you didn't do it when you were with me. And the answer to that question... He stopped again. She said quietly, the answer to that question is that you needed me to be smaller. He didn't deny it. She said, you didn't do it on purpose. That might actually be the worst part. He looked at her. His eyes were red at the edges. She registered it, and she felt nothing violent about it and nothing soft, something neutral, the specific emotional neutrality of a person who has moved past the place where another person's pain is their responsibility. She said, sign the agreement, Miles. He said, Vivian. She said, it's done, all of it. Sign the agreement and let it be done. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. At 4:47 that afternoon, his attorney delivered the signed agreement to Diane's office. At 4:59, Vivian was in her office on the design floor when Nico appeared in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment. He said, it's signed. She said, I know. Diane texted me. He came in. He sat in the chair across from her desk, which he had never done before. He always stood, always ready to leave, always occupying space as a point of transit rather than arrival. He sat now with his forearms on his knees, and he looked at her with something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the assessment, not the professional attention, something underneath all of that, something that had been there for weeks being held at a distance by the specific discipline of a man who had decided something about timing. She said, what? He said, the hotel opens in 6 weeks. She said, I know. He said, after it opens... He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, which was the first time she'd ever seen him look away from something he was trying to say. After it opens, I'd like to have a conversation that isn't about the project. She looked at him. She felt her heart do something specific and involuntary that she was not going to describe, even to herself, as anything other than what it plainly was. She said, what kind of conversation? He said, an honest one. She said, about what? He said, about the fact that I have been spending the last 6 weeks pretending that watching you work is the same thing as what it actually is. The room between them held that sentence for a moment. She said, which is, he looked at her directly, something I haven't let myself want in a long time. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He was already moving back toward the version of himself that operated in the world with control and purpose and no visible uncertainty, the familiar armor reassembling itself. He paused at the door. He said, 6 weeks, Ms. Hale. The building first. He left. Vivian sat in her office with the floor plans in front of her and the Hudson visible through the window and the specific vertiginous, terrifying feeling of a person standing at the edge of something that doesn't have a visible bottom and choosing, for the second time in as many months, to step forward anyway. She picked up her pen. She went back to building something that would last. The 6 weeks did not pass gently. They passed the way the rest of the project had passed, in the compressed, relentless currency of work that demanded everything and gave back only the satisfaction of seeing something difficult become real. Vivian lived inside the hotel in a way that was almost literal during those final weeks, arriving before the construction crew and leaving after the cleaning team, walking every floor at the end of each day the way a surgeon makes final rounds, checking, confirming, identifying the last remaining problems with the particular attention of someone who understands that the difference between good and extraordinary exists almost entirely in the details that most people never consciously register but always unconsciously feel. The ballroom had been restored, better than restored. The replastered walls had been finished with a technique she'd found through a specialist in Milan, a textured application that caught light differently at different hours, shifting from warm ivory in the afternoon to something closer to pale gold under the evening chandeliers. The acoustic panels, replaced in the rush order she'd negotiated that first morning after the vandalism, were a higher specification than the originals. The room sounded better destroyed and rebuilt than it had when it was first designed. She didn't say that to anyone. She knew it. That was enough. The rooftop terrace opened toward the Empire State Building in the newly corrected sight line. The glass parapet at 60 inches, creating a wind buffer that allowed the outdoor furniture she'd specified. Low seating, natural linen, the kind of material that looked like it had always been there, to exist in the space without the particular violence of a midtown wind making everything feel temporary. On a clear evening, the view was the kind that made people stop mid-sentence and forget what they were saying, which was exactly what she'd designed it to do. The arrival sequence moved guests from the street through a lobby that transitioned deliberately and invisibly from the kinetic noise of Midtown into something else entirely. A compression of scale and then a release into the main atrium, a shift in ceiling height and material that the body registered before the mind did, that made people exhale without knowing they'd been holding their breath. Marcus had watched her direct the final installation of the atrium stone and said nothing for a long time and then said, "It's like the building is breathing." She'd looked at him and said, "That's exactly what it's supposed to feel like." 3 days before the opening, Soren came to her office. She came in without knocking, which was new. She sat in the chair across from Vivian's desk with the specific directness of someone who has been deciding whether to say something for a long time and has finally decided to say it. She had a folder in her hands, but she didn't open it. She looked at Vivian. She said, "I want to tell you something." Vivian put her pen down. She waited. Soren said, "When Nico told me he was bringing in a new designer, I thought it was the worst decision he'd ever made professionally. I thought you were unqualified, inexperienced, and being given access to a significant project for reasons that had nothing to do with merit." She paused. "I made my opposition clear internally. I made it harder for you than it needed to be in the first weeks." Vivian said, "I know." Soren said, "The work you've done on this building is the best I've seen on any project I've been part of in 14 years. She said it the way someone states a structural fact, not warmly, not with the softening of compliment, just with the plain authority of professional assessment. I wanted to say that before the opening, not after, when it would just sound like everyone else." Vivian looked at her for a moment. She said, "The ceiling was always going to be the right call." Soren said, "Yes." A pause. "It was." She stood. She moved toward the door. She stopped and turned back, one hand on the doorframe. "For what it's worth, the arrival sequence is going to be in every architecture publication by spring, not because of the hotel, because of that sequence specifically." She left. Vivian sat alone in the office for a moment. She picked up her pen. She went back to work because that was what she did, but the things Soren had said moved through her quietly as she worked, settling somewhere she would return to later. The night before the opening, after every contractor had signed off and every surface had been walked, and the hotel stood in its completed state for the first time, fully itself, no scaffolding, no construction lights, no debris, just the building as it was meant to exist. Vivian walked through it alone. She started in the lobby. She stood in the center of the entry and let her eyes travel up the atrium and across the stone and along the light fixtures she'd specified, and up to the ceiling whose proportion she'd argued for in a meeting that had lasted 4 hours and produced at its end something that justified every minute. She walked the main corridor. She walked into the dining space and stood in the specific quality of evening light that came through the west-facing windows at that hour, the way she'd predicted it would from the orientation study she'd done in the second week. She'd been right about the light. She was always right about the light. She went to the ballroom last. She stood in the entrance for a moment before going in. Then she stepped through the doors and into the room she had rebuilt from destruction, the room that had been covered in red paint and accusation and the specific violence of someone who needed her to fail, and she stood in the center of it under the chandeliers she'd chosen. Not the originals specified in the plan, which had been adequate, but the ones she'd found through a lighting designer in Chicago who worked primarily for theater, fixtures that produced light with the specific warmth of candlelight at scale, that made every person standing beneath them look like themselves, but better, like the version of themselves they wanted to be. And she looked at what she'd made. It was extraordinary. She knew that without ego, the way she knew structural facts, because it was demonstrably, technically true, and because she could feel it in the room, the way she could feel the acoustic correctness of the ceiling and the spatial rightness of the proportions. She'd built something that would outlast the argument about whether she deserved to build it. That was the only answer she'd ever wanted to give. She heard footsteps behind her. Nico came in through the side entrance, jacket off for once, collar open, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle she recognized as something serious from the bar program she'd had no input on and had no objection to. He crossed the room to where she was standing. He held out a glass. She took it. He poured. He looked up at the room the way she'd just been looking at it, comprehensively, slowly, with the attention of someone taking in something they've been waiting to see completed for a long time. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The ceiling." She said, "The ceiling." He said, "Soren told me what she said to you yesterday." Vivian said, "It didn't need to go through you." He said, "It didn't. I'm just telling you I know." He turned to look at her. The chandeliers caught his face at the particular angle she'd designed them to produce. Warm, direct, without the flatness of overhead light. He looked like himself, but fully present in a way that the fluorescence of the design floor never produced. 6 weeks ago, I told you I wanted to have a conversation that wasn't about the project. She said, "I remember." He said, "The project is finished." She said, "It is." He looked at her steadily. He said, "I spent most of my adult life building things that were designed to be impressive and choosing not to let people close enough to see what was behind the impression. It was efficient. It was also—" He paused. He turned the glass in his hand once. "It was a particular kind of loneliness that I'd convinced myself was simply the cost of the kind of life I was building." She didn't say anything. She understood that he was saying something he'd decided to say, and that the thing it needed from her right now was space, not response. He said, "You are the most capable person I've encountered professionally in 15 years. You're also—" He stopped again, and she saw something she'd seen only once or twice from him, the specific fracture in the composure of a man who controls most things and is now holding something he can't fully control. "You are also someone I've been trying very hard not to want anything more from than what the project required." She said, "How's that been going?" He said, "Extremely poorly." She felt something move through her. Not the vertigo of the first night at the coffee shop, not the frightened aliveness of the morning she'd stepped into this building not knowing what she was walking into. Something steadier than that. Something that had been building in the specific way that real things build. Slowly, with evidence, from the accumulation of small moments that don't announce themselves as significant until you stand far enough back to see the shape they've been making together. She said, "Nico." She waited until he looked at her fully. "I came to this building 6 weeks ago with a bag I'd packed in 15 minutes, and a folder of someone else's architectural plans and the specific determination of a woman who was done being invisible." She paused. "I didn't come here looking for someone to fall in love with." He said, "I know." She said, "That's what happened anyway." The ballroom held that sentence. The chandeliers produced their warm, specific light. Somewhere below them, the hotel existed in its completed form. The building she'd argued and fought and rebuilt and refined into something she was genuinely proud of, the first thing in 6 years that was entirely hers. He reached out. He touched her face with one hand. Not the hand holding the glass, the other one, with the deliberate care of a man who does nothing casually. She stayed still. She let herself be seen clearly, in the warm light of the room she'd built, by the person who had, from the very first night, refused to look away. He said, "When I met you, you were catching a falling dessert display at 11 o'clock at night at someone else's party in a uniform designed to make you disappear." She said, "Objectively not my finest moment." He said, "You were the most quietly extraordinary person in a room full of people who spent a great deal of money trying to be extraordinary." He looked at her. "I've been waiting for the right time to say that. There isn't one." So, she kissed him. She did it without planning to, the decision arriving and executing in the same instant, the specific, impulsive precision of someone who has been careful for a very long time and has run out of reasons to remain careful about this particular thing. He kissed her back with the same quality his attention always had, complete, unhurried, as if he'd been intending to do exactly this and had simply been waiting for her to catch up. When she stepped back, she was breathing slightly differently. She said, "The opening is tomorrow." He said, "It is." She said, There will be 400 people in this room in 22 hours. He said, "Approximately." She said, "I need to sleep." He said, "You do." He didn't move. She said, "Nico." He said, "I know." He stepped back. He picked up his jacket from where he'd set it on a chair. He looked at her once more, with the look that she now understood had never been purely professional, that had always contained inside it the thing they were only now naming. He said, "Tomorrow night, after." She said, "After." He left through the side entrance. She stood alone in the ballroom for another minute, listening to the silence of the completed building, the specific silence of a space that is ready, fully itself, fully realized, waiting for the people who would come and feel things inside it without knowing why. She turned off the chandelier test switch. The room went to the ambient light of the city through the tall windows. She went home and slept without difficulty for the first time in 6 weeks. The opening arrived as openings always do, as the simultaneous culmination of everything and the beginning of something else. The moment when a thing stops being made and starts being experienced by people who have no knowledge of the cost of it. 412 guests moved through the DeLuca Midtown over the course of the evening, and what Vivian watched, from the edge of rooms she knew better than she knew most things about herself, was people having the experience she'd designed for them without knowing they were having it. She watched them exhale in the atrium. She watched them stop mid-conversation at the rooftop parapet, turning to face the sightline she'd corrected. The Empire State Building centered in the view as if it had always been intended precisely for this angle. She watched them enter the ballroom and pause in the entrance the way she had paused the night before, arrested by something they couldn't articulate. Rebecca Holt was there, from Manhattan Architecture Review, moving through the hotel with a photographer and a notepad, and she found Vivian near the bar at 9 o'clock and said, without preamble, "The arrival sequence. Walk me through the decision." Vivian talked for 20 minutes. Holt took notes without looking at her pad. The photographer took photographs of the corridor, the atrium, the transition point between compression and release. At the end, Holt said, "We're doing a profile, not of the hotel, of you." She said it the way she might announce a weather fact. 3,000 words, cover of the design issue in May. She moved away before Vivian could respond. Elara Castellano was there. The 71-year-old matriarch whose gala had been the night Vivian's life had turned moved through the hotel with the authority of someone who had been in extraordinary rooms for 50 years and had strong opinions about which ones earned the designation. She found Vivian in the ballroom at 10:30 and stood beside her and looked at the room and said, "My late husband built 3 hotels. Not one of them felt like this." She looked at Vivian. "You understand something most designers don't," Vivian said. "What's that?" Elara said, "That a room should make you feel like you've arrived somewhere. Not just somewhere expensive. Somewhere real." She moved away. Marcus was there too, in a suit that looked like it had been worn perhaps twice in his life, standing near the bar with the particular discomfort of a man who is more at ease on a construction floor and knows it. When Vivian found him, he handed her a drink and said, "The ceiling." Just that. She said, "I know." He said, "I've been in this industry 31 years. That ceiling is the best room I've ever worked on." He finished his drink. He looked around. "You should know that." She said, "Thank you, Marcus." He said, "Thank you for not letting us be mediocre." Miles's public correction ran the following morning, issued through the same tabloid outlet that had published the original photographs. It was brief and legally exact, confirming that the previous reporting on Vivian Hale's professional qualifications had been based on inaccurate information provided by a source acting in bad faith. It didn't use Miles's name. It didn't need to. The industry was small enough and the timing conspicuous enough that anyone paying attention understood the architecture of it. The criminal charges related to the vandalism and the procurement of illegal building access were filed 3 days after the opening. Curtis Vane had already provided a full statement in exchange for reduced liability, and the documentation Diane had assembled over 6 weeks was thorough enough that Miles's attorney advised him, in their first meeting after the charges were filed, that the evidentiary situation was not favorable. Miles entered a guilty plea 9 weeks later. He was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, full restitution of the construction damages, and 240 hours of community service. His startup, which had been in the middle of a Series B funding round, lost its lead investor within a week of the plea becoming public record. Vivienne did not follow the sentencing with particular attention. By the time it concluded, she was already deep inside two new projects: a restaurant commission in the meatpacking district from a developer who had been at the hotel opening and tracked her down the following week, and the early stage planning for a boutique property in Charleston that DeLuca International had acquired and intended to transform. She had moved from the Battery Park apartment into a space of her own in Cobble Hill, a two-bedroom with exposed brick and north-facing windows, and enough wall space to pin drawings floor to ceiling, which she did immediately and with great satisfaction. She still worked with DeLuca International. The professional relationship had evolved rather than ended, which was the right outcome and the one she'd known. Somewhere, it would be. The personal relationship evolved alongside it without announcement or ceremony, in the way of things that have been real for long enough that formalizing them feels less like a beginning and more like an acknowledgement of something that was already true. 3 months after the opening, Nico took her to Seoul. She'd expected formality, a family of significant means and significant reputation, the specific performance of introductions that happen when a man with his kind of position brings someone into rooms that have been protected. What she found instead was a 3-story house in a quiet neighborhood, the smell of food that had been cooking for hours. A grandmother who opened the door herself and looked at Vivienne for a long moment before deciding something. His grandmother was 83 years old and approximately 5 feet tall and had the specific authority of someone who has outlived everyone who ever doubted her. Her name was Hannah. She spoke to Vivienne through Nico's translation for the first hour, and then, apparently deciding that the translation was introducing inefficiencies, switched to English that was accented but precise and never again required assistance. She took Vivienne to her kitchen. She showed her the photographs on the wall. Nico at 7, at 14, at 22, the chronology of a person Vivienne had only known as complete. She made tea and sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at her with the assessing directness that Vivienne now recognized as a family trait, something genetic or learned or both. Hannah said, "He told me about the ballroom. The red paint." Vivienne said, "It turned out better than before." Hannah said, "That's what he said too." She poured tea into cups that had been used for a long time and were better for it. When he was 12, his father's business failed. Everything. House, cars, the company, everything. She held her cup in both hands. Nico took his father's ledger books and sat at this table and spent 3 weeks going through every account line. He was 12. He found where the money had gone. He found who had taken it. She looked at Vivienne. He didn't cry. He didn't talk about it. He just worked until he understood the problem completely. Vivienne said, "What happened?" Hannah said, "He waited 8 years until he had the position and the resources to address it properly, and then he did." She said it simply, without drama. "He is very patient with problems he intends to solve permanently." Vivienne looked at her tea. She said, "Is that what you think I am? A problem he's solving?" Hannah said, "No." She said it immediately, without hesitation. "You're the first person I've seen him bring here who made him look like he's arrived somewhere." She looked at Vivienne over the rim of her cup. "There's a difference between a man who wants to own something and a man who wants to be home. You should know which one you're dealing with." Vivienne said, "I think I do." Hannah looked at her for a moment and then said, "Fire never disappears. It only waits for someone to give it air." She said it the way someone states something they've carried for a long time and have been waiting for the right moment to give away. "I say this for you, not for him. He figured himself out years ago." Vivienne sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was warm and the tea was good, and outside the window the Seoul afternoon was doing something with light that was different from New York light. Softer, more diffuse, without the particular sharpness of a city that's always competing with itself. She said, "Thank you for that." Hannah said, "Eat something. You're too thin for someone who works as hard as he says you work." They stayed 4 days. She met his parents, his younger sister, who was an engineer in Incheon, and who asked her precise, interested questions about the acoustic properties of the ballroom ceiling that reminded Vivienne of the way Soren had finally started asking questions. She ate meals that lasted 2 hours. She walked through a neighborhood that Nico had grown up in, and he walked beside her and showed her things. The school, a park, a corner where something had happened when he was 17 that he told her about quietly and without self-pity. And she listened the way she'd learned to listen to buildings, with her whole attention, without the need to immediately respond. On the last evening, she stood on the roof of Hannah's house and looked at the city below her and felt the specific quality of a person who has traveled far enough from their origin point to see it clearly. Brooklyn was 10 time zones away. The gray morning and the kitchen and the 6 years of making herself small were not a different lifetime. They were the same lifetime, continuous, the necessary preceding chapter of the story she was currently inside. Nico came up the stairs and stood beside her. She said, "Your grandmother told me you went through your father's ledger books when you were 12. He said, "She tells everyone that eventually." She said, "She told me to make sure I knew which kind of man I was dealing with." He said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "That I think I do." She looked at the city. "Do I?" He was quiet for a moment. The sole evening moved around them with its own rhythm, unhurried and indifferent to the specific weight of what was happening between two people on a rooftop. He said, "I'm not a simple man to be with. My work is complicated in ways that don't always stay at work. My world makes demands that aren't negotiable." He looked at her. "I will never ask you to be smaller. I will never stop being interested in what you build. I will not be easy." He paused. "But I will be completely permanently yours, if that's what you want." She looked at him. She thought about the morning she'd sat in a dark kitchen with a black business card on the table and the specific terrifying feeling of a door being open. She thought about what it cost to walk through it. The gray uniform, the gray marriage, the 6 years of accumulated invisibility, the red paint on a ballroom wall, the way her hands had felt holding those architectural plans for the first time, and recognizing that the part of herself she'd put in storage hadn't gone anywhere, had simply been waiting for the conditions that would let it breathe. She thought about what it meant to be seen accurately by someone who wasn't interested in the convenient version of her. She said, "Yes." He didn't say anything. He took her hand and they stood on the rooftop looking at Seoul in the evening, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because everything that needs to be said has been said, and what's left is just the fact of it, solid and real and built from the ground up. 1 year after the night at the Castellano Gala, the Manhattan Architecture Review ran its profile of Vivian Hale. The cover photograph was taken in the hotel ballroom, standing beneath the chandeliers she'd chosen, in a blazer that was not gray. The piece was 3,200 words and concerned itself entirely with her design philosophy, her process, the specific decisions that had made the hotel what it was. It mentioned Nico DeLuca once, in the context of the project commission, and not again. The headline read, "The designer who couldn't stop seeing what was wrong." She read it at her desk in the Cobble Hill apartment on a Sunday morning with coffee she made herself in her own kitchen. She read it once. She set it down. She looked out the north-facing window at the Brooklyn light, which was sharp and particular, and hers in the way that only things you've chosen truly are. Her phone produced a text from Nico. He was in Chicago for a project meeting. The text said, "Page 1. As it should be." She looked at the text for a moment. She typed back, "Get home safe." She put the phone down. She picked up her pen. On the trace paper in front of her, the early lines of the Charleston property were waiting, loose and exploratory still, the phase of a design when anything was possible, and the problem hadn't yet declared its shape. She loved this phase. She loved the moment before the solution, when all she had was the accurate understanding of what was wrong and the absolute certainty that she would find what was right. She leaned over the paper. She began to draw. Outside, Brooklyn moved through its Sunday with the indifferent continuity of a city that doesn't stop for anyone's particular ending or beginning. Inside, a woman who had once stood in a gray uniform at someone else's party, catching a falling dessert display, invisible and quietly extraordinary, sat in her own light doing the work she was always going to do. She had stopped waiting to be given permission. She had stopped apologizing for taking up space. She was home.